stories in the Torah, although fascinating, are not just pieces of history, but they're actually instructions for life. They're lessons to be learned from. The Torah is not a history book. If it was a history book, it did a very poor job because there's a lot of contradictions, there's a lot of inconsistencies, there's a lot of missing gaps, and we're introduced to Abraham when he's 75 years old. We know as children there are fascinating stories that happened to him in his childhood and his journey and discovery of God. But in the Torah itself, we don't get any of that, because the Torah only tells us those things which are pertinent for future generations. In fact, there are actually hundreds of thousands of prophets, and we don't know any of their names. We know nothing about their lives. We don't know who they were, where they lived, what they accomplished, nothing. And the idea is because we only know about the 55 prophets and the prophecies that are pertinent and relevant for all future generations. Those are the ones which are recorded. And even amongst those 55, there are certain figures, especially in the book of the prophets, that most people have never heard of. No one probably heard of Yiftach, that we're going to learn about today. Most people haven't heard of him. And there's about one chapter dedicated to his life, because we want to kind of unpack whatever little bit of information that we have. We want to pay attention and the nuances and the words, and to try to get an idea who these people were and what were they thinking, more importantly. This is after the 5 books of Moses. So Moses has died, which actually right now in the Torah portion that we're reading, we're nearing that point in history. The Jews are slowly towards the end of their journey in the desert. And this is already after they've entered the land of Israel under the leadership of Joshua, Moses' student, and he passed away. And now there's what's called the era of the judges. It's a period of about 355 years, some say 400 years. But this is before we've kind of become a united kingdom. We don't have we don't have a monarchy yet. This is before the age of kings. That's what we're going to learn about next week, the first king of the Jewish people. So there's a lack of Jewish cohesiveness. There's a lack of a structure, and it's a kind of live and let live society, and it's a little bit of a jungle. And the book of Judges is actually, there's a lot of fascinating stories, and as you see over there, there's a lot more than just what we're learning about in this course. There's Samson the Mighty, who I'm sure that's probably one of the more famous judges that people have heard of. He's obviously an amazing story, but really the theme and the pattern in this era is very, very repetitive. In fact, the text itself in the book of Judges kind of says it itself. It says that this was a time where people just did what was righteous in their eyes, meaning people did whatever they liked. Nobody respected authority. There was no really authority, and people were led astray, and then they would kind of get seduced into these surrounding nations. And then once that happened, that's when the oppression would start, and they would be being challenged by other enemies. And due to the suffering, then they would cry out to God. And depending on the circumstance, we'll see today was a little bit different. God would usually appoint someone to be a judge. A judge meant basically his role was to kind of lead the people in battle. Wasn't necessarily the biggest scholar at all. Again, we'll see that's a glaring example of that today. And that was kind of, he was to rally the people and to lead them into success, and to kind of restore a small time of peace until, again, a disaster. It was just a constant pattern of it. It was a roller coaster. So that was pretty much the era of the judges. And it's in that context that we have this man called Yiftach. Yiftach didn't come from the most prestigious of backgrounds. The Torah is quite explicit and says he was the son of a harlot, although there are different interpretations what exactly that means. The rabbis in the Medrash explain that it's because she was either she's a concubine, or another thing is that she was married without the standard procedure of a ketubah, the marriage contract. But others say quite literally that she was a prostitute. So because of this, his half-brothers felt he was not worthy of inheriting their father's estate. Another typical, siblings fighting over the inheritance. And this is before the father's still alive, and they're already fighting over it. So they kick him out. So this is obviously a terrible tragedy, and this is kind of planting the seeds of Yiftach's, background. So he's chased away by his half-brothers, and he flees to the land of Tov, which was considered a very riff-raff type of neighborhood. He gets acquainted over there with the street thugs, and he essentially becomes a gang leader. He becomes like one of the boys. And he's hanging out with the riff-raff, and that becomes his lifestyle. And then we see though how the elders of Gilead suddenly realize that we need a general. We need someone who can lead us in battle, because this 18 years going strong, this oppression of the Ammonites, it's too much, and we need someone who can lead us in battle. And lo and behold, they have to go now and lower themselves and turn to none other than Yiftach. And they beg him to come back, and he's like, "Okay, you're asking me? You're responsible for kicking me out. Where were you when I experienced this terrible, injustice? My own family threw me out of the house. It was a terrible tragedy, and you guys stood by silently." And actually, this was contrary to Jewish law. Jewish law entitles any child, regardless of their lineage or legitimacy, to inherit the father. So the question is, and this gives us why did the elders of Gilad stand silently by? Why they were considered like the rabbis of the time. Surely they knew this basic law. Why would they allow such an injustice, an innocent child, to be thrown out of his house? And this just gives us an idea of the corruption of the times. It's like the story they tell about a rabbi who was opening his mail one morning, and he takes out a single sheet of paper from the envelope, and he finds on it the word imbecile. Right? What a lovely community. This is what the rabbi gets in his mail. So the next Shabbos, he gets on the pulpit, and he has something to say. And he says, I have many people who write letters to me. And usually, many people, they write the letters and they forget to sign the names. But this week, I received a letter from someone who signed his name, but he forgot to write a letter. So this was kind of the yin and yang situation. The elders didn't respect the regular people didn't respect the elders. Everybody was just chutzpah, as they say. So because it was such a disaster of a period, and it was the lack of structure and authority, so there was a power vacuum. And of course, we know in politics, when there's a power vacuum, the people who usually take advantage of that are not necessarily have the best intentions for the larger masses. And usually it becomes might makes right society. And the more powerful you are, the more rich you are. That's kind of how that's how the direction things will go. So the elders came into this environment that was very, very toxic. It was basically an environment where power, was dictated by those who were of higher stature and the elite, and those who had money and wealth and power and influence. And so they had to kind of play politics. Although they were rabbis, they had to kind of pick their battles and pick and choose when it's worth, starting up with the so-called elite. So here's a classic example. Yiftach comes from a wealthy background. His father's side seemingly had a big estate. That's why the brothers threw him out. They were a wealthy family, and the elders were faced with a problem because they didn't really want to start up with the family of Gilead because they were a powerful family. On the other hand, there is an injustice over here. So faced with this predicament, it was just easier to kind of like minimize the situation and just, kind of push it away and move on, and hopefully everybody forgets. And of course, that's the whole irony of the story, right? As the great line goes, I might be butchering it, but be kind to those people on your way up, because they might be the same people that you see on your way down. And that's like exactly what the elders experienced. Yiftach was someone they thought they could just kind of, shove into the rug. It's just an outsider, son of a harlot. Most people don't know him, most people won't care about him, and we can move on in life. And sure enough, he becomes the person that they all turn to for help, and they need him to rescue them. If God never asks us for anything that we cannot do. If we're in a situation, if we're in an environment or a challenging task, find ourselves with a challenging task, although it might be difficult, the fact that it's under our radar means that we have been blessed with the capability to overcome it. And that was the mistake of the elders of Gilad. Yiftach was on their radar. They surely were aware of this injustice, being the leaders of the community. And they should have known that if God put them in this predicament, it means that they were very much capable of dealing with it. So now we get to the crux of Yiftach's story, and this is probably the graphic part.
The king of Ammon did not listen to the words that Yiftach sent him. The Spirit of God was upon Yiftach, and he went through Gilead, Manasseh, and Mitzvah of Gilead. From Mitzvah of Gilead he proceeded to the land of Ammon. Jephthah made a vow to God, "If you deliver the Ammonites into my hand, whatever emerges from the doors of my house toward me, when I return in peace from the Ammonites, shall be for God, and I will tender it as a burnt offering." Yiftach traveled to the Ammonites to battle them, and God delivered them into his hand. He struck them a mighty blow. The Ammonites were subjugated to the Israelites. Yiftach came to Mitzvah to his house, and behold, his daughter was coming out toward him with timbrels and with dance. She was an only child. Other than her, he had neither a son nor a daughter. When Yiftach saw her, he rent his clothes and said, "Alas, my daughter, you have destroyed me, and you are the cause of great trouble to me, for I have opened my mouth to God, and I cannot go back." She said to him, "My father, you have opened your mouth to God? Do unto me as you vowed, because God has exacted vengeance upon your enemies, the Ammonites." She further said to her father, "Allow me one request. Leave me be for 2 months, and I shall go and wail upon the mountains. I shall mourn my virginity, I and my companions." Yiftach said, "Go," and he sent her away for 2 months. She went with her companions and lamented her virginity upon the mountains. At the end of 2 months, she returned to her father, and he carried out his vow, and she never knew a man.
No way to whitewash this or cushion this story. Obviously, we know the Torah embraces a culture of life, of human sacrifice is repugnant, is disgusting, and it's repeatedly outlawed in the Torah, time and time again. So really, there's two approaches to this story, and the truth is, even the second approach, which I'll just say right now, he didn't actually kill her, is not that much better, and possibly even worse. And essentially, the second approach is that he built her like a little shack or whatever, like a shanty on some mountaintop, and she basically spent the rest of her life over there in what essentially was solitary confinement. Only saw people, human interaction. According to one commentator, she didn't actually see these people. When the daughters of Israel would come, they would just converse through the window. So she, in a certain sense, she was living a life of hell that was probably worse than actual death. So the second interpretation doesn't make this. We're not trying to offer it as some type of apologetic. In a way, it's even worse. But there is another approach. That's what I wanted to mention. Starting with the Ibn Ezra. This is in text 8a. The Ibn Ezra, who is one of the classical biblical commentators, and he can't fathom the idea that a shofet, a judge of Israel, one of the great leaders in Jewish people, a shofet wasn't just a simple thing. This was considered, it meant that he was one of the transmitters of Torah and of the Jewish people. How could it be that a leader of the Jewish people would commit such an abominable act? So he says, you actually have to read the verse carefully. Yiftach says, if you deliver the Ammonites to my hand, whatever emerges from the doors of my house towards me shall be for God, or I will tender it as a burnt offering. Meaning the letter Vav in the Hebrew can either mean and, or it can mean or. So he's going with an approach that it means or. In other words, he's saying that if it's an animal that comes out of my house, I'll offer that as a sacrifice. But if it's a human being, then I'll dedicate that person to God. Not too different to what Hannah, for example, does in a different story when Hannah dedicates her son Samuel to be of service to God and spend his life in servitude. So this is how he explains Yiftach's vow, that it wasn't, he didn't actually kill her, but rather he dedicated her he sanctified her to spend the rest of her life in seclusion and in service and in prayer. He actually brings proofs of it, because if you look carefully in the verses, and that's why it's important to pay attention to the nuance, it says, she asks her father for time to bewail her virginity, specifically. Why is she asking for that? Maybe she should be mourning the actual death. And also, more particularly, the story never actually specifies that Yiftach slaughtered or sacrificed his daughter. It says very clearly, he carried out his vow. Meaning, it doesn't say he killed her, it says he carried out his vow, whatever that means. But most importantly, it has to be taken into account that it's unreasonable, and this is the opinion of many commentators, to assume that a Jewish leader would be guilty of such a reprehensible act. It's mind-boggling that a Jewish leader would do such a thing, sacrifice his own child. The classic rabbinic position, so the previous position is more like the later authorities. The classic rabbinic position is that he did indeed kill her. He killed his daughter. This is what Nachmanides says, the commentator in page 18. He says he disagrees with Ibn Ezra. He writes very sharply that don't listen to the empty words of the Ibn Ezra, who had actually lived in a generation before him. They used to argue a lot in all different places of biblical commentary. It's quite fascinating. But he says you can't try to sugarcoat this story. It happened exactly the way it happened. Reading it with a straightforward lens, and he messed up. So regardless of the version of events that we choose to accept, Yiftach committed an unconscionable act. The truth is, it was very stupid. It was a reckless mistake, because it was so basic. The idea that you cannot make a vow. The laws of vow are complex, but some of them are very basic, and that is one of them being that you can't make a vow that has to do with somebody else. You can't make a promise on behalf of someone else. You want to make a vow that's your problem. Don't involve somebody else into your mishagas. And also, you can't make a vow that completely contradicts Torah. A person can't say, I make a vow to eat on Yom Kippur. It says the law is, the vow is batal, it's null and void, it's meaningless. You're just spewing words. A vow, it cannot contradict a basic precept of Torah. You can't vow to kill someone. You have no obligation under any authority to fulfill that vow. It was a complete, terrible error, And some suggest that from here we see that actually Yiftach was, the Gemara says that he was an ignoramus. It says he was an Am Haaretz, he was illiterate, and part of that was to do with the fact that he grew up in the riffraff neighborhood because he was expelled. So everything kind of all ties in, He's one of those people that you put him in the chair and he'll tell you about his childhood trauma, and this is why he is the way he is today. Because he grew up in that environment, he wasn't privy to experience Torah scholarship and learning around other people, and therefore he was an ignoramus, and therefore he didn't know basic laws like the laws of vows. But then our sages tell us that actually there was another individual over here in this story that was also bears some responsibility for this grand mess up.
Yiftach's oath was improper. Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, was alive at that time, and Jephthah should have gone to him to annul his vow, but he did not. Yiftach said, I am the leader of all Israel. I should go to him. Phinehas said, he needs me. I should go to him. Once one conducted himself with hubris, and the other conducted himself with hubris. Woe to the man with hubris, for it buries its masters and never results in anything good.
This was Pinchas and Yiftach. Yiftach was the shofet. He says, "Hey, listen, I'm the judge. He should come to me. He should be offering his advice." And Pinchas says, "He needs me." Pinchas was the spiritual leader. He was the Kohen Gadol. He was the high priest. He certainly would know these laws and would have been able to annul the vow. There's something called hataras nadar, the idea of annulment of vows. You might be familiar. We do this every year before Rosh Hashanah. We have the annulment of the vows that we took upon ourselves the past year. So there is this possibility. In other words, you're never stuck in Judaism. You make a promise, you make a resolution. There's always ways out. In the words of the Medrash, in another place, "Bein din l'din of the hanaira." Because of this one, because of that one, somebody was destroyed. Yiftach's failure was, essentially was his ego to approach someone who could have helped him. As you see, he was relatively ignorant. Now, it's important to know that ignorance in and of itself is not a sin necessarily. But if someone is ignorant in a particular field, they should have the humility to approach one who knows, one who can guide them and help them. Ignorance is only dangerous is if it's followed by arrogance. If we're ignorant and then we're too arrogant to want to deal with that ignorance, and we assume that we know everything, we don't need anybody's help, then that's a problem. Of course, Yiftach didn't want to kill his daughter. The text makes that very clear. He was destroyed. He was destroyed. He was crying. Oh, he tore his clothing. But he felt like he had a problem. He felt he had stuck, and he made an assumption on his own that nobody could help him. Nobody can help him figure out his predicament. And as the leader of Israel, he had no need to go to anyone because nobody could help him. And the important idea over here is that you might be the leader of Israel, but there's always someone out there who can share some insight, possibly even wiser than you are, from who you should seek counsel. And Pinchas' fail, on the other hand, was his refusal to go to one who needs his help. Like the good old days when doctors used to make house calls. Now it's the patient needs me, he should come to me. So,
man who's his own lawyer has a fool for a client.
Exactly. This is the narrative part of the story. And it's a shocking story, to say the least, and we cannot really fathom the unimaginable cruelty. How could a father ignore his daughter's cries? How could a human being stoop so low, never mind a Jewish leader? It's not something that we usually give the benefit of the doubt. Whenever we discuss stories in the Torah, we always try to find the explanation for what mistakes. This is one of those stories that's like, there's no way out of this one. Especially a leader. Rightly or wrongly, we hold them to a higher standard. But let's put aside for a moment, although again difficult, the fact that Yiftach sacrificed his daughter. Up to that point in the story, he did seem like a good fellow with good intentions. Before we read it wasn't like someone, it wasn't a sinister person. We saw someone that actually evoked God's name a lot. In the back of your book, this lesson, you have more text where he describes his negotiations with the king of Ammon, and he evokes God's name a lot. He's something when actually our leaders today fighting wars could learn from. He recognized, and that was the whole idea of the vow, that ultimately his success and his victory in battle was an account of God, and he wanted to thank God. He wanted to bring a gift to God. So his intentions are very much appropriate. But obviously, the mindset that of the conclusion that of human sacrifice, it's something that we can't just whitewash, and it's something the Torah again repeatedly admonishes and rebukes. And in ancient times, the only way out is that the Jews were influenced by the pagan cultures, and this is what the surrounding environment. And that's why time and time again, God has to warn them, when you enter the land, do not be swayed by these cultures. Do not be influenced by these terrible practices. And in addition, we have to remember, and again, we're not justifying Yiftach, we're just trying to give a little bit of historical context. He was expelled by his brothers from Israel, from his Torah teachers. So he was, although well-intentioned, he was not wise in the ways of Torah. And this is an important idea in text number 10, student page 21, says that a person may be righteous, but even so, if he does not study Torah, he has nothing. And we find this idea in the story of Yiftach. Because he wasn't a ben Torah, he wasn't a student of Torah, Ein biyadei klum, he lost his daughter, he had nothing, and it was a disaster. Yiftach was a very believing man, a very spiritual person. His belief in God was unquestionable, and he had very strong faith, and he experienced miracles in his battles, and he was successful. So clearly we have to kind of find that balance where he did, God, and it does say the Spirit of Hashem rested upon him, so he did have a connection. The problem is that when a person is only spiritual and only, when you're religious without wisdom, or if you're like a passionate zealot, religious extremist, but without any, you're not grounded in Torah wisdom, it's actually very dangerous. A religious person who doesn't have the bread and butter of Torah wisdom can be a very dangerous person. He can weaponize religion and do all kinds of things with it, as we see. So on a small level, Yiftach's mistake is somewhat relatable. But we are trying to understand how is it that such a good person can make a tragic mistake. And that is something that we could relate to, because that's this idea where sometimes we are so passionate about something, a particular religious endeavor, a mitzvah, whatever it is, and we get so almost obsessed to the point where it actually comes at the expense of somebody else. It was an expression we used to say, when it comes Passover time, not to make your children the carbon Pesach, right? The Paschal sacrifice that was brought in Egypt, that's what you're supposed to bring as a sacrifice, not your children. Sometimes a family could be so caught up in the preparation of Passover, and they're cleaning and they're scrubbing and they're being very careful, and anytime the kid has the tiniest crumb, and they're screaming at the kid, and they create such a toxic environment that the kid becomes the sacrifice. So it's something that we could relate to in the sense that we sometimes are misguided in our religious pursuits, where we are so passionate and so obsessed that we forget about the other person that is maybe not, able to be a recipient to that type of environment. That was Yiftach's failure. He felt like nobody can help me. His own daughter, in another medrash, talks about how his daughter, it's a very powerful medrash. It expands the conversation that they had, and she says, "Is this what Jacob did when he vowed?" He says he vowed to all his belongings. Did he sacrifice his children? No. Is this what Abraham did? God told him specifically not to sacrifice his son. So, and she was trying so hard, she came up with all kinds of arguments. It says she went down to the mountains, which the commentators say is a euphemism for the Supreme Court. In other words, she was trying her best to get out of this, to nullify her father's vow. But he was so stubborn. I guess there was also a tinge of arrogance as well. And he felt he was so stuck. He felt like this is a vow, meaning this is something I've decided and there's no way out. Nobody can help me. Not even the greatest spiritual Jewish leader, Pinchas, the high priest, cannot help me. And this is a mistake that sometimes we all make, right? We take, our proverbial vows. We promise ourselves things. We put these self-imposed expectations, and we decide, azoyim nicht anders in Yiddish, meaning this is how it is and no other way. There's no way out of it. And we don't think for a second that maybe it doesn't have to be this way. Maybe you ask somebody else their opinion and hear what they say. Maybe there's a perspective that actually you don't have to do this. You don't have to, suffer and bring everyone else around you to suffer. Maybe there's a way out. Maybe you could do things in a normal way. But that was Yitzchak's mistake. He was very one-track minded. Another lesson that we see from here is the human condition to procrastinate, the tendency to always push things off. And we, too often I'm sure everyone can think of their own common examples, whether it's a leak in the roof or something in the car or a health issue, where we say, it's a small problem, whatever, it's not a big deal. And we kind of procrastinate until it mushrooms into something much worse and serious. So this was kind of another mistake. There's also national examples of this. Springs over here, how in 1938, the Western powers, they turned a blind eye to to Hitler's aggression. They thought, okay, whatever, Hitler, some crazy guy with a mustache in Germany, he's shouting on the podium. You shouldn't be too worried. Don't pay too much attention to him. And we know how that followed. So dismissing problems is another lesson that can be gleaned from this story. This is the idea that this was kind of the mistake of the elders of Gilead, right? There was what they saw, and then there was how they interpreted it in their minds. And the two obviously couldn't be further from the truth. And that's often the greatest cause of our mistakes and why we tend to procrastinate, because when we find an issue, either we minimize it and we say, it's not a big deal and I'll deal with it in another time, or we exaggerate the problem. We say, this is way too overwhelming, this is going to take too much time and energy and resources, that we don't deal with it either right away. So different causes, but the same end result. How do we deal with these problems? So this all comes down to objectivity. The verse in Devarim tells us specifically about court cases, but it's a lesson in life in general. Not to pervert justice, not to show favoritism, and the famous words, Ki ha'sheicha ya'aver eni chachamim. Famous words in the Torah, bribery blinds the eyes of the wise. In other words, nobody is safe from cognitive dissonance or their personal biases. Going back to the elders of Gilead, they made mountains of molehills and molehills of mountains. They were totally, skewed in their perception of things. They felt they underestimated their capabilities and they over-exaggerated the family of Gilead's capabilities, and that was the problem. And then, of course, we know the full extent of that story and the damage that it caused later on because of their inaction. So, what can we actually do about this? How do we deal with these overwhelming issues? One of the ways to deal with this is actually a very powerful Jewish concept called cheshbon hanefesh, which is the idea of, literally means a soul accounting. But the idea that we should set aside a time where we can kind of look at the week ahead, for example, and see what our goals are and what needs to be accomplished. And those things that we think either we think they're minimal, to maybe reconsider, and perhaps they actually require attention. And those things that we think are too overwhelming, to further analyze those things and think to ourselves, is it really that hard? Can I really do I really have to push this off? And that requires a lot of soul reflection, soul accounting. But another equally important, if not more important, I would say, solution to the problem of procrastination and minimizing our goals and our challenges is getting advice from a mentor. And this is something that in the 1980s, the Rebbe was super passionate about, and he launched this grand initiative. And at times he was crying that people weren't taking him seriously. The idea was basically based on the Mishnah in Ethics of Our Fathers that says, Aseh l'charav. Appoint for yourself a teacher, a master, a mentor. It's not necessarily limited to specifically a scholar or a rabbi at all, actually, because like you see in text 14, in student page 26, this is from the commentator, the Meiri, who was a commentator in the Talmud. He actually says, and it's fascinating, the Meiri lived in South France, he's writing the Middle Ages during the Crusades, and he's saying he has this time for this beautiful, friendly advice. He says it's vital that every person has a friend who you could discuss all that happens in his life. So he's not necessarily limiting it to, only problems. Anything, whatever's on your mind, whatever's on your heart, have someone that you can share that with. It's super, super important. And he says, even the wisest of the wise, maskil shel maskilim, tzarich atzil zulase, need somebody else's advice. And that's all too obvious in today's lesson with Yiftach, right? He was the shofet, he was the judge, that he thought, who am I? I don't need anybody else's advice. You should have had a little humility and realized that there's someone out there that can help you. There is someone out there that can give you perspective, and you didn't have to go through with what he went through. And at the same time, from Pinchas' perspective, he was obviously blessed with proper perspective, and he obviously knew that this was an area that Yiftach was lacking, and he was an ignoramus, and he wasn't familiar. So from his angle, he should have actually initiated. He shouldn't have don't wait for someone to come ask you advice. If you know someone needs help, someone could use your perspective, you have a particular expertise or a particular experience that you could share with someone else that would be of benefit, and if that person needs that help, you should offer it. So many, when people have different skewed perspectives about Judaism, about Jewish people, especially today with what's going on and Torah and mitzvahs, we actually have a responsibility to share the knowledge. If you know Aleph, teach Aleph. You should share that clarity that you have with somebody else who might be lacking. Just like we're supposed to, there's obligations to share our money, to give charity with those who have less. So it's the same thing. This is the Rebbe would always call this, spiritual tzedakah, the spiritual charity, to share our wisdom, our experiences, our knowledge, and that's something every person can give. And next week we start the era of the king, the Jewish monarchy. We're introduced to the first king, King Saul, and we'll soon see his struggles and his strengths and how he dealt with his issues. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much.